All right, so good evening. Thanks to those of you who are taking the time to listen in. I appreciate it. Welcome to our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. This workshop is about defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. This is our fall schedule, which will be running through the entire semester. And today is week 7, the Atlantic Part 1. And obviously you can watch the prior ones from earlier weeks. And if you're interested, you can also watch the ones from the summer, which are focused on the theoretical or the abstract understanding of global conflict and cooperation. So let's go ahead and jump to week 7, the Atlantic Part 1. And here you see a picture from Google Earth of the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic. So let's go ahead and jump in. Our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First is to define the Atlantic region. Secondly is to describe an example of conflict in the region. And then lastly is to describe an example of cooperation in the region. So first about the region itself, here you see a map of the North Atlantic Ocean and the South Atlantic Ocean. So note here that the North Atlantic Ocean is basically the sea between the United States and the Caribbean with Europe and North Africa and Western Africa. And the South Atlantic region is the western part, the remaining western part of the African continent, and then the Horn of South America with Brazil all the way down to the Falkland Islands and Antarctica. So it's a very broad region. Now, you might be asking, how does this compare to the Pacific? Well, the Pacific's much larger. But when it comes to the broader diversity with countries, the Atlantic probably is more diverse, given the number of countries that border the Atlantic, both north and south, and just how important these both regions are to the world when it comes to trade, international affairs, and the like. So that's your definition, our definition of the Atlantic region. So let's zero in on conflict. And the two conflicts I want to, or the one conflict I want to show is what's called the Battle of the Atlantic. So you might have learned about this in a U.S. history course or in any kind of course that focuses on conflict. And the Battle of the Atlantic, let me go ahead and open that up here. We'll go ahead and have this read to us, a few paragraphs.
The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign, 7-8, in World War II, ran from 1939 to the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, covering a major part of the naval history of World War II. At its core was the Allied naval blockade of Germany, announced the day after the declaration of war, and Germany's subsequent counter-blockade. The campaign peaked from mid-1940 through to the end of 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic pitted U-boats and other warships of the German Kriegsmarine, Navy and aircraft of the Luftwaffe, Air Force, against the Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, United States Navy, and Allied merchant shipping. Convoys, coming mainly from North America and predominantly going to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, were protected for the most part by the British and Canadian navies and air forces. These forces were aided by ships and aircraft of the United States beginning September 13, 1941. The Germans were joined by submarines of the Italian Regia Marina, Royal Navy, after Germany's Axis ally Italy entered the war on June 10, 1940. As a small island country, the United Kingdom was highly dependent on imported goods. Britain required more than 1 million tons of imported material per week in order to survive and fight. In essence, the Battle of the Atlantic involved a tonnage war, the Allied struggle to supply Britain, and the Axis attempt to stem the flow of merchant shipping that enabled Britain to keep fighting. From 1942 onward, the Axis also sought to prevent the buildup of Allied supplies and equipment in the British Isles in preparation for the invasion of occupied Europe. The defeat of the U-boat threat was a prerequisite for pushing back the Axis in Western Europe. The outcome of the battle was a strategic victory for the Allies. The German blockade failed, but at great cost. 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships were sunk in the Atlantic for the loss of 783 U-boats, the majority of them Type 7 submarines, and 47 German surface warships, including 4 battleships, Bismarck, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Tirpitz. 9 cruisers, 7 raiders, and 27 destroyers. Of the U-boats, 519 were sunk by British, Canadian, or other Allied forces, while 175 were destroyed by American forces. 15 were destroyed by the Soviets and 73 were scuttled by their crews before the end of the war for various reasons. 5.
And so you can go on to read about more in detail the Battle of the Atlantic and just how complex it was. This Wikipedia page goes on for quite a bit. But this is a clear example of conflict in the Atlantic region, largely focused in the North Atlantic. And what I also like to do is just share a recent media, or in this case, movie that came out on this conflict in the region. It's titled Greyhound with Tom Hanks as a star. I'll go ahead and play the trailer for that film as well.
Congratulations on your first command at last.
I'll always be looking for you, Evie. Even if I'm 1,000 miles away.
Air escort to Greyhound. You will now be out of range of air cover for the next 5 days. How many crossings does this make?
This is my first.
I got some.
Most likely a U-boat.
He's trying to slip under us! Fire!
We have a kill.
Distress rockets, sir.
We have hits directly on the convoy.
The Wolfpack's hunting us.
U-boat, starboard bound!
We've lost 7 ships and 50 souls.
What you did yesterday got us to today.
It's not enough.
Fire as they dare! Targets disappeared, sir.
Here they come.
What are we gonna do?
We'll bring hell down from on high.
So I like sharing that trailer, one, because my son, Ethan, who's 4, has seen that movie so many times. He'll read the opening intro and then he'll describe all the things. And at this point, he'll get his collection of boats and subs, both little models and ones he's made out of Legos, and just have at it. So this film just gives you kind of like in the seat of one of the many military craft in the North Atlantic battle. And I think it's just impactful to know that how complex of that conflict was, and basically its importance in the broader conflict of World War II. And obviously, the United States was successful in maintaining a functional bridge with boats from the United States to England, and then that helped to continue the effort into continental Europe and then to the defeat of the Axis. So this is an example of conflict in the region, historical one. Next, I like to focus on cooperation, and particularly on NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So let's go ahead and check out NATO's website and see what they got going on. So this organization, we'll go ahead and pull up what it is and why it matters. So NATO consists of 30 different members, mostly countries in the North Atlantic, so like the United States and Canada, and then of Europe. So some of our traditional partners like France and Spain, but then also other ones as well, like North Macedonia, Latvia, and Estonia, the smaller Eastern Bloc countries. And note that NATO membership is open to any other European state in a position to further the principles of this treaty and to contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area. NATO also has what it calls a membership action plan. It helps aspiring members prepare for membership and meet key requirements for providing practical advice and targeted assistance. And they like to point out some basic points about what NATO is. It's a political and military alliance, right? So a very clear form of cooperation. It's focused on collective defense. It's a very strong sense of a transatlantic link, obviously based on the past conflict from World War II. And then they have these strategic concepts more recently developed and then going forward. And note that they have a range of activities. So things like how they make decisions and consultations with members and as a treaty organization, the operations and missions that they conduct jointly between countries and their governments and their militaries, the partnerships that are formed, and then developing the means to respond to threats. So what they mean is like what kind of hardware, software, tanks, missiles, boats, planes, and everything else that they have in their arsenal in order to maintain the security of the region. And let's go ahead and listen into this, see if this plays. I had that problem before. They normally have a set of key events, but the birth of NATO was back in 1949, so right after the war. And then here, its continued growth after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then you had NATO developing partnerships with former adversaries after the breakup with the Soviet Union. And then as the European Union was strengthening its bonds, eventually achieving its European Union status, they brought in other organizations. And one of their first major issues they had to deal with was, or crises they put, is Bosnia and Herzegovina, which there was an ethnic cleansing by the government, and they needed to respond to that. And then in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, and then NATO invoked Article 5, which basically says we're going to come to the aid and defense of the United States given these attacks. And then in 2003, NATO took command of what's called the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. And then lastly, they developed this strategic concept of active engagement and modern defense. And so it's really important to note that the way this organization structures, you have NATO delegations, which have nuclear planning group and the North Atlantic Council, and they have military representatives, and those military representatives form a committee. And under that committee, they have Allied Command Operations and Allied Command Transformation. And then there's a Secretary General who helps kind of organize all this work. And then there's subordinate committees under the NATO delegations. So it's a very sophisticated alliance or example of cooperation. Now, the importance of NATO is basically twofold. One, it's demonstrated the continued commitment with the United States and the European continent to maintain strong relationships in the form of a military and political alliance. Secondly, it serves as what's an effective counterweight. At the time with after World War II, Russia, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, basically grew its power and moved away from continental Europe and developed what it called was the Warsaw Pact. And that was their response to NATO. So that served as like these two buffers between superpowers at the time, United States and the Soviet Union. The third reason it's important now in contemporary times was basically the member countries provided staff, military, and otherwise support in Afghanistan to fight Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And now with the conclusion of Afghanistan, there's a big question in Europe about what does this mean for our relationship with the United States? And this is all being worked out right now. So when we think about how important issues are, we think about how important leadership is, we think about how crucial our histories are, and then our future is, you think about NATO, and it's basically going through a reevaluation of what its priorities are, in contrast to where the United States is. So if you watch the prior two workshops on the Pacific 1 and 2, there I talk about how the United States is making what's called the Asian pivot. So the United States, instead of looking eastward through the Atlantic to our friends in Europe, we're now spending more time as a country and as a government and as a military looking west towards the Pacific and building those relationships. And what that's done for NATO and for the European continent is say, okay, what's our role here? What's going on? And as the European continent has matured to the point now where it has a European Union, sophisticated form of basically a federalized government with obviously member countries that have very strong traditions and histories and autonomy, it's having these conversations go on in Europe with the clear-eyed knowledge that Russia now has maintained regional ambitions, and that there's these growing or these continued terrorist threats that emanate largely from the MENA region, or the Middle East, North African region, and that there's partnerships that need to be maintained and expanding the efforts of the European Union and in NATO. So this is a very clear form of cooperation. I just know that the nature of it's changing. So we'll see how it evolves in time going forward. Now, last thing I'd like to point out is implications of all this. So we had this historical battle during World War II of the North Atlantic. We have the emergence of NATO. And then we now fast forward to today, what's going on in the North Atlantic. So I came across this article that I want to go ahead and share with us. And this was in the U.S. Naval Institute's news website. And it just was published as I was collecting resources for this article. It says Navy creates new Atlantic destroyer task group to hunt Russian submarines. So let's go ahead and have this play for us, because obviously in my mind it's pretty interesting, and gives us a sense of the implications of how these broader themes play out over time. So go ahead and move this through here, and we'll go ahead and put it out loud.
The Navy has created a new task group on the East Coast to ensure it has ready destroyers that can deploy on short notice to counter the Russian submarine threat in the Atlantic Ocean. Task Group Greyhound, which officially declared initial operational capability on September 1, is a fourth-generation model for destroyers that is embedded within the Navy's optimized fleet response plan. The plan is to take destroyers that have recently completed deployments and are awaiting maintenance availabilities and make them ready for training and operations in the Atlantic. Greyhound is designed to provide the fleet with predictable, continuously ready and fully certified warships, Rear Admiral Brendan McLean, the commander of Naval Surface Force Atlantic, said in a Monday ceremony aboard USS Thomas Hudner, DDG-116, in Mayport, FLA. The ships will be ready to accomplish the full range of missions, including tracking Russian undersea activity in the Atlantic and maritime homeland defense for our nation. The task force shares a name with the 2020 surface warfare movie Greyhound, in which a collection of Allied destroyers defend a North Atlantic convoy from German U-boats. USS Donald Cook, DDG-75, which recently completed several years forward deployed in Rota, Spain, and is now based in Mayport, and Thomas Hudner are the first destroyers to become part of the task group. USS The Sullivans, DDG-68, which is currently deployed with the United Kingdom's Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group, will join the task group in January when it returns. USS Cole, DDG-67, and USS Gravely, DDG-107, will become part of Greyhound next year when Donald Cook begins its maintenance period.
So this article goes on to describe how this task group is forming and why it's really forming. In this case, the Russian Navy has developed next generation attack submarines armed with long range land attack missiles with ranges of 1,000 miles or more. And Moscow, which is the capital of Russia, is also developing a new class of submarines that will field a school-sized torpedo armed with a nuclear warhead. So you hear this and you're just like, I kind of laugh, but it's really serious because you're talking about the potential for conflict and of war between countries. So when you think of implications, right, it's kind of like this ebb and flow of time and these ebb and flow of strategic responses by countries, their governments, and by collections of countries' governments. And obviously in the North Atlantic region, there's a very keen interest about what's going on and what's happening. But in pointing this out, I think it's useful to know that just the challenge that any region faces, and particularly the United States, knowing that they are functionally have presence all over the world, partners all over the world. And so that means friction between ourselves and other countries around the world as well. So we'll see how this all shapes up as time goes on, but this was a significant, gesture towards Europe to say, look, the U.S. isn't leaving the Atlantic. Just because we're making this Asian pivot doesn't mean that we've forgotten everything that's gone on and will likely go on in the region. And here's an example of the United States' and the government, the military's commitment to the region by forming this new task group, which would have some pretty sophisticated capabilities in monitoring the high seas. So with that, we'll go ahead and move to our discussion. Thanks for taking the time to listen in, and take care.